I hope you had a good break, and thanks for sticking around for what I think is probably going to be the most interesting part of the day, actually hearing about the research from City-REDI. What we're going to do in this session is we're going to hear a range of different views about the likely impact of Brexit in the regions based on the research that City-REDI has done through their ESRC-funded Brexit project as part of UK in a Changing Europe initiative. So each of our panellists is going to give us a sense of what they think are the main issues based on their research, and then hopefully we will have some time for a bit of discussion and some questions and answers at the end. So to start us off, I'd like to invite Professor Philip McCann from the University of Sheffield, a great friend to IPPR North and a great expert on the questions of today, to give the opening presentation. Philip.
I haven't said anything yet. Okay, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here today. This is the fourth in our series of workshops that our research project has put together. Our first one was in Scotland, working with the three devolved administrations, including Northern Ireland and Wales. The second one was in the West Midlands, looking at the issues around advanced manufacturing and supply chains. The third one was last week in London, looking at the impacts and the issues facing the service industries, particularly in the south of England, but services nationally. And then, of course, today is looking at the issues raised for the, if you like, the pan-northern agenda and questions. So there are four different workshops with each one with a different focus, and we're obviously trying to interlink and overlap the different issues that arise in each case. So our research team, the work I'm going to present today is work which is with Frank van Oort here. It's coordinated by our team leader, Raquel Ortega-Agiles, who you've already met at the University of Birmingham. We also have Bart Loss, professor at the University of Groningen, Mark Thiessen, who is at the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. And then I'm also going to present a little bit of evidence from a broader team that also includes Chloe Billing, Nicola Kortinovis, Denise Vink. So we're a large team of researchers across 5 different institutions, 2 different countries. And what we focus on is the issues of Brexit, which are facing regions and sectors inside the country. So we look at not just the UK, but all EU countries, all EU member states and all of their regions. So I'm going to go very quickly, but I'll try and give you an overview of what this shows. The first point is you'll be aware that we have lots of discussions in the press about trade surpluses and trade balances. So the basic argument is because we have a trade deficit with the EU countries have a trade surplus with us, therefore they're going to be very desperate to give us a really good deal. That's the basic argument. The argument is nonsense. It's based on a logical mercantilism that disappeared in the middle of the 19th century because of the Corn Law debates. And for a strange reason, it's resurfaced in politics and political narratives in the UK in the last couple of years. Also in the United States, also you'll be familiar with these discussions. There's not a single economics course anywhere in the world that teaches mercantilism. Why? Because it is nonsense. Trade doesn't work like that. The idea that we export services, the French will export wine to us and the Italians will sell us Prosecco. As I explain to my students, for example, you take an engineering company in the West Midlands, say. They get a contract with Toyota or with Land Rover. What do? They don't go to the financial markets in London. The first thing you do is to go to local financial specialists who work for decades and generations on finance for auto engineering. They know all the technological issues. They know all the legal issues. They also get local legal people involved who specialize in intellectual property around automotive components. All the value added is done very high up at the very early stages of the production process, even before anything's actually made, all the design work, all the intellectual property work. Then those drawings, templates, blueprints are developed, and what do? Then they're sent to a joint venture which is in Italy, working with a British company to produce a new level of technology, which then goes to another joint venture company in France. Then the Italians, the French, and the British work together to produce a prototype component, which is then manufactured in Denmark. It's then sent to a sub-assembly in Germany. The Germans add value. They send it back to the UK. It's produced as an intermediate component and an engine component, which then goes back to Germany into a car, which is then sold to Sweden. That's how supply chains work. 6, 7, 8, up to a dozen times things go forwards and backwards across borders. And that's across borders and sectors. And the UK economy is very, very highly specialised, high up. It's in the upstream part of supply chains. We actually look like a primary industry exporter. If you look at the value-added structure of the UK economy, we are one of the most upstream producers, both in services and in manufacturing. Whereas in comparison, Japanese economy, the German economy are much more downstream producers. They produce much more final products, BMWs, Toyotas. We are very much up the supply chain across all sectors. What does that mean? It means that you cannot take gross exports and gross imports and talk about surpluses or balances of deficits. It doesn't mean anything. You can't say anything from any of those discussions. Why? Because you have to work out what is the value-added component of those incredibly complicated supply chains. How does that relate to the domestic economy, our industrial structures? You cannot say anything by trade surpluses. Gross exports, gross imports don't mean anything because you're double counting re-exports, re-imports with exports and imports. And when you've got things moving half a dozen times across borders, you've got re-exports of re-exports of re-exports of re-imports, re-imports, and re-imports. You have to use a very complex technique. It's called value-added and exports. The basic argument was in the American Economic Review a few years ago by Koopman, Wang, and Wang. It's extremely complicated mathematics. But there is a way of doing it. What you do is you need to develop what's called input-output tables, which is a description of the internal structure of every economy, how all the supply chains work inside a country, and how they relate to the trade of that country, sector by sector. And then that needs to be broken up according to country by country by country, so you end up having a series of matrices that link the internal structure of an economy to the internal structure of all the other countries in the world, linked by all the trade flows across countries and sectors. And there's a way of doing it. And the guys in our team are the first people to do it. In fact, the demonstration of this was also in the American Economic Review a couple of years ago. Bart Loss, who's not able to be here, is one of our team. So what we do is the first thing is the data building exercise behind this, which has been led by Frank, Bart, Mark, who's not here, we estimate is something like 15 to 20 person years of work. It's been going on for a long time, working on different things. But what we realize is you can use these data to analyze Brexit. What we have is the World Input-Output database, which shows all those trade demand structures inside countries and between countries across 80% of global output. It's over 40 countries, and we have it broken down then within Europe, region by region, for 245 regions, and we have it down to 14 industries. So think about the structure of the data is we have 14 industries by 14 industries by 245 regions by 245 regions, all embedded in a 40 by 40 matrix. It's basically 14 million observations for a single year. And what we can do is this. We can identify what is the exposure of all the regions and industries of the UK and for the whole of Europe to Brexit. What do we mean by exposure? It's how much is your economy dependent on and at risk of the Brexit reality. That's how we do it. And the way you do it is you have to use a technique, it's called hypothetical extraction, and the argument goes like this. This is what the trade looks like at the moment. Stuff goes forwards and backwards everywhere, as I've just described. Imagine you put a wall up around the UK. Suddenly all trade in and out of the UK to the rest of Europe stops. For 1 second, 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, 1 year, who knows? Just imagine that hypothetically. What you do is you compare the difference between that and that. Now that is very complex mathematically, how do you do it? But by comparing the difference between that and that, that is how you work out the value added in exports controlling for these very complex trade flows, which are normal. Okay, that's how you do it. Of course, ironically, the strange thing is that's modeling the worst no-deal arrangement. Imagine at the last minute the talks collapse, completely collapse, and the legal basis of all international transactions is suddenly ambiguous. As Catherine Barnard, part of UK and Changing Europe, says, the only real winners will be lawyers. Imagine that's the case. It's actually, analytically, it's the equivalent of that. But we're not modeling a no-deal case. We're using this analytical argument to explain and to calculate the exposure of all regions. And we're not saying this is the impact of Brexit. What we're saying is these are the implications of Brexit. In other words, how big are the structural, economic, and institutional adjustments that your regions and your industries are going to have to undertake in the coming years in order to respond to the post-Brexit realities? That's what it's like. You know, if you're Aldershot and you get drawn in the FA Cup against Colchester, it's not a big ask. If you're Aldershot and you get drawn against Chelsea or Manchester City, it's a much bigger ask. You might still beat Man City, but the probability and what you're going to have to do it is much greater than what you're going to have to face playing Aldershot or playing Colchester. That's the way to think about it. What does it look like? All of this is published, by the way. In your leaflets, your brochures, you'll see examples of this, and you can Google all this and you can download it all. It's all open access. This is what it looks like. The regions in the Midlands and the north of the UK, in dark green on the left, are the most exposed regions anywhere in Europe to Brexit. Ironically, the regions that voted leave are the most exposed, and the more that you voted leave, the more exposed you are. That's the strange reality, and we've published all of this. This is all public information. The next most exposed places after the UK regions are the regions in the Republic of Ireland. So the regions in the UK, their exposure levels are between 9.5% of GDP output and 17%. With the regions in the Midlands and the north of England, exposure levels are typically around 14 or 15% of GDP. People say, well, is that a big number or a small number? Contractions associated with the global financial crisis after 2008 were typically about 3%. These are 5 times bigger in terms of orders of magnitude. It doesn't mean that's what will happen, but this is what we're playing with. This is what we're dealing with, these kind of numbers. The Republic of Ireland, the exposure levels are about 10% of GDP. And then if you look on the left-hand side, it's very hard to see the rest of Europe because basically the colouring is so pale. Why? Because the numbers are so much lower. So on the right-hand part, what we do is we simply take the UK out, and then what you see in terms of the blue colouring, again, the Republic of Ireland is by far the highest exposure levels of 10%. The next most exposed parts of Europe are the southern and western regions of Germany. Why? Because precisely of the supply chain arguments I've just said. These are the automobile-producing regions, the pharmaceutical, the chemicals regions, goods coming in and out of places like Teesside, Immingham, Hull, hour by hour. After the German regions, the next most exposed are the Dutch regions, with exposure levels about 4.5%. The German regions' exposure levels are 5 to 6%. The Belgian regions are the next ones down. This is Antwerp and so on, 3.5%. The French regions are all around 2% and below, and the rest of Europe, so you think about voting rules in the European Council, all of the Mediterranean regions, the Central and Eastern European regions, and Northern Europe, as in the Nordic regions, all their exposure levels are less than 1% of GDP. In other words, Brexit has no effect on them. 2/3 of the countries in Europe have no real trade exposure to Brexit. It doesn't matter. There's other issues, of course. If you take a country like Poland, issues around immigration, immigration, and so on. Of course, there are other issues, the Baltic states, issues around security, NATO, and so on. But in terms of actual trade arguments, there's basically no exposure at all. The exposure levels are very concentrated in Northern and Western Europe. But of course, the UK exposure levels are much higher. You get the same results on local labour income. So you take places like, East Yorkshire, for example, North Lincolnshire, which would be a very strong pro-Leave voting region, has exposure levels about 16 to 17% of local labour income. These are the highest anywhere in Europe. These are the raw numbers, what you see. UK exposure levels, each region, it's between 10 and 17%. The Irish 10, as I said, the Germans 4.5 to 6.5, with an average of just over 5. The Dutch 3.5 to 4. Belgian and so on. And then what you see is the rest, basically almost no exposure at all. So the exposure of the UK is 4.6 times bigger than the exposure of the rest of Europe. The trade surplus, trade deficit arguments is, well, in economic terms, is utter nonsense. It's a ratio of 4.6 to 1. The UK is more exposed as a whole to the rest of Europe. And some of our UK regions have exposure levels which are 8, 9 times the exposure levels of the rest of Europe. We can also do the same thing sector by sector, and we published this around the same time that the Minister for exiting the EU said we couldn't do this sectoral analysis, we couldn't do the industry analysis. Well, strangely, we'd been working on these for several months, and we published them, well, more or less in the same week. You do the same thing. What do you get? Across 54 sectors. What's really interesting, the most exposed sectors are service industries, but they're the hidden services, not financial services. If you look third from the bottom of that list, is financial services activities. That's the classic city type thing. We calculate their exposure levels are about 8% of their activities. which is very close to what the City UK calculates. It's almost exactly what the Financial Times calculates. And these are total numbers. So these bar charts horizontal show the total number of workers whose jobs are directly exposed to Brexit. Actually, in the core city activities, it's actually very small. It's about 8% of GDP. But look at the ones across the top: administrative and support services, wholesale trade, legal and accounting activities, activities auxiliary to financial services, professional and technical services, computer programming, consultancy, architecture, engineering. These are all classic business services activities, which are high productive work, primarily university graduates. They're the fabric of the economy of central Leeds, the fabric of the economy of central Manchester, of many parts of the London economy. These are the industries and activities that come into supply chains very, very early on. So the kind of exports that we get from the north, for example, in automotive, defense, aerospace, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, advanced manufacturing, biosciences, energy-related sectors, all of these service activities are contributing to those value chains. Many of these companies in these arenas don't actually export. What they do is they sell services to the local supply chains, which themselves are exporting. And so it's all hidden. And what do these numbers mean? Along the top, they are absolute raw numbers. So along the top, 500,000 jobs in administrative technical services are directly at risk. About 250,000 jobs in legal and accounting services, and so on. So what we calculate is basically 2.5 million jobs are directly at risk. Not in, basically as a direct function, they're directly at risk. These are large numbers. And in particular, they are in the more productive parts of the economy. It accounts for about £140 billion worth in today's money. And it's particularly scientific, technical, computer programming, these kind of activities. So it gives a very different picture on a lot of political narratives, which talk about trade surpluses, trade deficits, concerns about the financial markets in the city and so on. What our argument is basically is the parts of the economy, both in terms of regional and industrial sectoral, which are the most directly exposed to Brexit, have basically, in effect, no representation in any of the negotiations. None whatsoever. And if you are interested in this, all the things I've been talking about, they're already hosted on our website. Raquel Ortega at the back, you'll know, is our team leader. The website at the University of Birmingham, the City-REDI Institute, you can Google everything. You can download all the papers. You can see all the coverage. This has had widespread coverage. We've had parliamentary questions about these issues. The House of Lords are well aware of this. Michael Heseltine's been talking about it recently. It's been in Le Monde, Financial Times, Guardian, Washington Post, New Statesman, many, many different areas, prospects. So this is... Our work now is receiving very high, wide-ranging coverage, so you can access any of this, and the details are all on the website.
Okay, thanks very much, Professor Philip McCann. And I'd now like to invite Alison McGovern, MP for Wirral South, to give her thoughts on this.
Thank you, and thank you all this morning for a warm welcome. It's lovely to see you here in Leeds. I'm Alison McGovern. I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Wirral South and also the co-chair of the Labour campaign for the single market. And I really just want to build for a few moments on what Phil has said just now, but listening to that presentation and the detailed work that's gone into that analysis of the actual exposure that our economy has to Brexit, you can understand why, for the most part, in the House of Commons, we talk politics and not economics. Getting a proper picture of what Brexit could actually do to jobs and growth in my constituency is much more complicated than I think many in politics actually understand. And it's really building on those comments that I want to do this morning. Just to say, unfortunately, I do have to go back to the lovely House of Commons quite swiftly, so I'll have to leave before the panel ends. My apologies for that. But let me make 3 brief points. Essentially, the situation that Philip has just described arises because of 40 years of development of highly integrated supply chains. And I see that in my constituency, where lots of my constituents do the very, very high value bit of manufacturing, whether it's aeroplanes they're making or motor vehicles, or whether they're involved in the bit of services that supplies engineering and other parts of that very northern economy. I see that, and I think that one of the myths that has been most problematic over the past year is that because 80% of our economy is services, somehow the Brexit debate ought to be about London and the South East. Because in people's in the psychology of the British economy, we do have this kind of a very oversimplistic services south, manufacturing north. And it is a sort of infantile picture that somehow, because we make things and we sell them abroad, somehow the drop in the value of the pound and the potential of Brexit will somehow help the north. Whereas actually, as you've heard from Philip, the opposite is true. We have this 40-year-long development of highly integrated supply chains where my constituents day in, day out work with inputs to production that have crossed European borders 3 or 4 or 5 or even more times before they are eventually in a manufactured good that is then sold elsewhere. So what can be done to manage the risks that Phil has described? Well, I would suggest we need 3 things, 3 priorities now. Firstly, I hope people have followed the recent debate that we have had on customs. It's a very important debate that's going on within the government about what the customs arrangement should look like. And I won't go into the detail of the difference between a customs partnership and maximum facilitation. But I'm pretty clear that some sort of customs union with the EU is absolutely required so that we have those complicated integrated supply chains given the best possible chance we can of survival. However, it's obvious to me that it's just not enough because many of the products that we rely on for jobs and industry, especially in the north of England, are made to standards that are agreed with the European Union, and those standards are part of the rules of the single market. It's not just about our customs processes, it's also to do with the rules of the market that we sign up to. And, you know, if you think about even a relatively simple product that might be made in my constituency, I've got a fantastic cereal factory that makes boxes of cereal in Bromborough. And, you know, they'll be getting the wheat perhaps from the Netherlands, perhaps some of the other inputs from the Republic of Ireland, which we do a lot of trade with. And those goods will be brought together in Bromborough in my constituency. And all of those inputs will have their own rules and regulations and scientific standards, all of which, if we want to continue that trade with the EU, we will have to comply with. So we are going to need some sort of strong relationship with the single market if we want the kind of manufacturing that we have relied upon in the north to continue. So my message number 1 is, if you listen to what Phil says and you're worried by it, customs is not enough. You have to engage with the question of the single market as well. Which brings me to my second point, which is that I think people are finding it easier politically to think about the inputs to production as regards to goods. Certainly in politics, people do. It's good. It's easy to talk about frictionless borders for goods. What is harder is immigration. And I'll be absolutely frank with you. Economists, I know, don't find it difficult to talk about the labour market and immigration at all, but politicians often do. It's a touchy subject. But as I found, having stood 3 times in a Labour-Tory marginal, if you're in politics and you're not prepared to talk about immigration, then what are you really doing? So I think we need to be quite frank that some of the risks of Brexit that Phil's talked about do relate to the construction that we look set to put around our labour market. That if we're saying to a company like Unilever, we'll do everything that we can to help your business keep going, to keep goods moving around, but we want to stop people moving in and out of our country, that is going to have an impact on our economy too. And I won't go into great detail about that because I don't want to delay too much, but I think we've had a very political conversation about immigration. I think it's time that we had an economic one. I think it's time that we considered the fact that for somebody like a kind of technical services company, in fact, we have the technical side of our economy is growing fast. We've got a shortage of people skilled in computer coding and other kinds of analysis and programming. It would be great to think that we could grow more of those skills, but even then, with an aging population and a shrinking working age population in the UK, we're going to need people to come here if we want our economy to keep growing. And I think for that reason too, people have to come to an accommodation with what we want to do about the single market. Now, my final point is this. If you take one message away from this panel, I would advise that the point you really walk away from is the one that Phil made at the beginning, which that they have found that the areas that voted with most enthusiasm for Brexit look set to be the areas that are most punished by Brexit. And as far as I can see it, there's one way out of that. And that's the central British government in Westminster and Whitehall decides finally to properly give power to the north of England. Because it's a bitter irony to me that the city in our country that has most economic power of its own is also the city with the most political power of its own. That's London. There is one city in England that has a devolution settlement to rival Scotland and Wales, and that's London. And ask yourself why it is that northern cities have been unable to properly economically plan for their future, to have a sense of control over where their economy goes. And I think you find your way back to that lack of political power. So if we want to offer people who voted for Brexit a real chance and not a false prospectus, I would suggest that my final way to manage the risks that Phil has described is a proper, fulsome devolution of power to northern towns and cities. Thank you.
And thanks very much to Alison for that, and I think we at IPPR North would certainly agree with your final point. I'd just like to now invite Professor Frank van Oort from the Erasmus University in Rotterdam to say a few words in response.
Thank you very much. I hope I can stay within a few words, but because I want to talk about competitiveness. Part of the research project was what Phil explained, how much are regions in the European Union exposed to trade, and then automatically you start thinking, what can you do as a region to better your position in these trade networks? Which regions are actually winning market share from you on growing markets? In which other regions in Europe you can actually win? And if other regions win from you in market share, what do they do better than you? And that's what we wanted to find out using a lot of data, big data, just like Phil talked about. And what you see on the background here is already kind of websites, because I am going to focus on some regions in the north, like Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, but you can actually look at it from a point of view from every region in Europe. So we made something summarizing all the data in which you can click on a certain industry, you can click on a certain region, and then you actually find out in this website who are your real competitors. Who are the regions in Europe who win on the markets you are working on? And we do that on quite a detailed level of 56 industries, but several industries make different products. So you can also have different industries making different products. And it is by coincidence, I didn't really know that Cologne was the sister city of Liverpool and Leeds, but I took this from the news, saying how can the north of England actually compare to cities in the Netherlands, which is sometimes called the Randstad area, or how do we compare to cities in Germany? And should we even look at them? Can we learn from them in a certain way? And how is Brexit then impacting this kind of competitiveness? What can we know about it, and how can we know about Brexit impacts? So we used for starters, the same analysis Phil presented, Professor McCann presented. But now we were not only interested in exposure, we were also interested in impact. Because between exposure and impact, there is substitution, there is pricing, and there might even be thinking the things you import from abroad, you might even make yourself, will actually gain for you because you can create employment. So there's a lot of calculations following. So we actually looked at, we used the same kind of analysis, but we then look at how does it affect competitiveness. And competitiveness, in first instance, we looked at how much does it lead to higher prices in regions. If your firm has to make 2, 3, 4, 5% more production costs to create something which can be created in Germany, Dortmund or Köln quite much cheaper, you definitely lose in competitiveness. So we have to make the translation from exposure to price levels. And that is quite a step, and it's actually we worked on this for the last months. So this is extremely recent to present. So we used the same line around the UK, and we looked which regions are suffering more from price increases. And actually, you can then get a mixture of different value chains. For instance, British steel is exported to Germany. Germany export beer cans to the Netherlands. The Netherlands fills them with beer from Heineken. Beer is then transported to the UK, and actually I can order in my hotel here Heineken if I want. So this procedure is already about 4 different products in 3 different countries. And this is a very simple example, and this is exactly what Professor McCann was talking about these value chains and how complex they can be. And actually, margins on these flows are extremely small. It's only 1 or 2% margins on all these flows. Otherwise, you would have made it yourself, or you would have got it from China or from other places, which is even cheaper. So the margins are extremely small. And if you get a price increase of 1 or 2%, you might already be out of business. It's actually what we heard in Birmingham, because what I will present says that pricing in the region of Birmingham will actually be 2% higher because of Brexit. And then the person representing automotive industry said, well, then probably we have to reconsider being here, because 2% is already too much for us to cope with. So we looked at production cost increase, and it's the same kind of map. This time it's in red. The darker the color, the more you get production cost increases, and that's what we use as an indicator for competitiveness. Now, it's not immediately all the regions in the north. It might be regions which are more agricultural and regions which are more involved in certain value chains. But this takes into account that you can substitute things within the UK. You can also use other kind of inputs to create things. So a lot of calculations. I don't want to talk about that. But you see the least cost increases seem to be in London, and also some other regions seem to suffer much more than other regions. And then you can take it down to certain industries. Which industries see the largest cost increases in the end? And I just circled some which are important in the 4 regions in the north, which you can see here. So I looked at some in Liverpool, some where are they specialized in those regions, and how much cost increases can you see? And we have the same debate as Professor McCann was saying, is it much or is it not much? Yes, it is much. Because if firms in Dortmund and Köln do not get these increases, or at least maybe even get better conditions, you might actually lose out in your competitiveness. So we looked at all kinds of industries. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but you can find all these things in the websites and look at it. So performance of important sectors, then you can actually analyze. So for instance, for Manchester, we looked at high-tech industries. For Liverpool in business services, Leeds financial services. Leeds becomes much more specialized in it. I really agree saying it's not only London who's working on that. And in Newcastle, you can look at activities related to materials. And here you see a diagram. And what's important to remember, if you are in the right part of the diagram, you can see them for each region. The right part of the diagram means you actually win market share from others. And only in the case of Leeds and the financial services, you see you actually end up, over a few years, in the right-hand side. So financial firms in Birmingham gain market share, even over London and even over other regions in Europe. But for high-tech industries, in Manchester, you see they're on the left-hand side of their diagrams. So they're losing market share. They're still growing because there's much more demand for the product, but they are not growing because of getting a larger piece of the pie. They're only growing because the pie is growing and you have a certain share in it and you're not able to make it larger. So a lot of regions who face growth in the north, they actually think they're growing very fast. They are, but that might be demand-led growth instead of structural growth, which leads to more competitiveness. So you can find for the examples, it's really in which you have structural growth. I only took out Leeds now, but I also wanted to show you that a lot of sectors which you think you are very competitive in, it means that regions in Europe actually perform better on many of these aspects. So they're here below. If you know this, you can look, Leeds is winning from other regions. What can you learn from those other regions? How can Leeds even become better in the financial services? So then you can look at competitive losses and gains. This is all the things aggregate together. I used green for being more losses of competitiveness. Maybe I should have, of course, red the other way around. But the more green meaning you lose in competitiveness on markets which are region-specific and they are actually sector-specific. Actually, you can see that Liverpool and Leeds are red. So they're actually gaining market share, it seems, on most of their specializations. But that's only because the regions surrounding them are doing very bad and you do most trade with the surrounding regions. Because if you only look at international comparison, comparing all the UK regions with regions on mainland Europe, you see all regions turn green. So you lose competitiveness and you get cost increases from 1 to 2 to 3, 4%. And this is additional on tariffs and additional on other things which we don't even know, so we put them in as scenarios using other people's data. Well, to end with, you can look at what kind of factors and indicators are now related to regions in Europe which perform better on your specific market. And if you look at, for instance, in Leeds, you can actually see if you want to become much more better in Leeds in financial services, it is about innovation, it is about housing, it is about educational level skills, things that are mentioned a lot. And I think those things should always be on the agenda because you can have this story everywhere. But it becomes increasingly important if you want to overcome this 1 or 2% cost increase you will get compared to the European ones. So then you really have to excel in these kind of issues. And they have been on the agenda for 10, for 15 years, so it becomes really difficult to do that. And you can do that for all kind of other areas as well. So to end up, I have another slide about how does the north of England end up with one single urban zone. Maybe that's a bit related to the previous speaker. All those cities individually, we can look at them on our website, but actually if you take them together, you get much more critical mass. And maybe that's also interesting to look at. There should be something joined in the north. So from Liverpool to Hull, it seems to be one big region. And then you get Leeds specializing much more in financial services and Liverpool much more in chemicals and other kind of ICT-driven manufacturing. I think that's important to create critical mass and also kind of variety that can create new employment and new innovation, which you really need to overcome the competitive disadvantages which come out of our analysis. One final thing, if you look careful at this slide, there's, as I'm Dutch, there's something here in the corner, and it actually it really says something about European integration. It says the UK hub for airlines, it's not Heathrow, but it's Schiphol. So it also means that this region is also, you can fly from this region to Schiphol. I fly tomorrow at 6 o'clock, but I could have flown 4 times a day. And I can also fly from Cardiff and from every other region to Schiphol Airport. So this integration is important, and it might be very important to see the linkages between the European regions, which are really necessary for your competitiveness. And there's a lot of complexity if you want to influence it. But I think it's a very hard job if you want to keep up your competitiveness, given all the trends we are presenting in our research. Thank you.
Thanks so much for another really fascinating insight into the potential impact of Brexit. We're going to finish our discussion with Professor Andy Pike from Newcastle University.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion today. I think, as you've seen, this research is important, timely and vital as all you economic governance actors at the subnational level and at national level, of course, too, are grappling with Brexit to try and work out how to plan, respond, adapt to what it might bring. Of course, it's a unique, unprecedented, uncertain thing. It's a shock, it's a process, it's very difficult to engage with as a research and policy issue. And certainly given its kind of negotiated nature as well, it's a kind of moving feast, if you like, of issues that keep getting thrown up, which make it hard to deal with. And I think the research has assembled some really telling, unique data sets. It's providing some very sophisticated analysis, going deeper, as Phil was just explaining there, beyond these gross trade flows, which seem to be distorting some of the political discussion, to try and get a handle on these intermediate goods and services networks, trade within and between firms across the piece, trying to understand where the value is actually being added in these networks, and also trying to break down the elements of regional competitiveness, as Frank was talking about there. And I think the approach is sensible to try and understand the extent to which regional GDP or output and labour income are actually being put at risk as a consequence of future Brexit-related trade barriers. And the numbers are substantive, as was described. The idea that something like 12.2% of national GDP for the UK is at risk, that 10 to 17% of GDP for some UK regions is in question, and something like 2.5 million jobs. So these are substantive figures which need to be part and parcel of the broader debate. And the conclusions, of course, are stark. The idea that the adverse effects of these trade-related changes are likely to be more severe in regions which have the least ability to respond to adverse shocks. So it's those economically weaker regions that start out that are the ones that are most vulnerable. And also this idea that it was mentioned earlier by Steve Rotherham from the Liverpool City region perspective, but the idea that Brexit is likely to increase rather than reduce the UK's long-standing and persistent problems with spatial disparities in economic and social conditions. So these are very important, I think, to bring into the broader debate. On the sectoral analysis, again, some excellent work being done to identify the particular sectors that are going to be affected potentially or at risk. And the worrying thing here, I think, for city regional policymakers, we've had a very city-centric kind of model of urban growth and development driven by trying to create agglomeration economies across the piece. But it's the very kind of knowledge-intensive business services that are going to be amongst the most at risk from Brexit. And I think that really does perhaps raise some pause for thought about the kinds of models of city growth that we've been following in the UK. And again, given the emphasis in the industrial strategy nationally on productivity, the project's worrying finding that it's often those people in jobs that are more productive than average that are the ones that are most at risk. So again, how's that going to help us solve this productivity puzzle, I think is a very telling point to reflect on. The regional competitiveness work, again, fantastic analysis here that kind of situates the UK and its regions in the European context to really break down how sectors compete, how that relates to market share and to the kind of particular factors that can be addressed. And again, there's a strong regional and geographical differentiation across the piece then, with some of the kind of traditional strong parts of the UK and its region, London and the Greater South East, then do fairly well in competitive terms in their international context. Now, I'm sure there's a whole host of things that the project will be addressing, and I think it'd be nice to try and drag back the trade analysis back into these regional economies to try and get a handle on some of the multiplier effects. So from the export to the sort of non-export residential type activities within regions to again try and get a sense of the economy that isn't export or trade related that might be at risk from these shifts. And also, and again it's hard because there's no real precedent for Brexit, is trying to get a sense of adaptive capacity. You know, to what extent are these vulnerable economies likely to be able to demonstrate some resilience and bounce back, and maybe looking at some previous recessions and the extent to which regions have or haven't been able to bounce back from those might give us some clues, although it's a unique situation to how these things might unfold in the future. Now, moving on then to the kind of economic development, governance, the policy challenges, I think there's a really key point here that a lot of the issues that we have in the UK context then are long-standing concerns and predicaments that we've been wrestling with in local, urban and regional policy terms for many decades, arguably. So things around poor connectivity and infrastructure, limited diversity in economic structures, weak innovation capacity and potential, lagging skills, this highly centralised system, this peripherality where all these growth-enabling public investments are going in mostly into London and the Greater South East. Now the issue, of course, and as the project reveals, is that Brexit is kind of aggravating and accelerating, amplifying in some ways some of these long-standing concerns. So while we start to think, I suppose, about how we plan, respond, adapt to Brexit, we have to try and think about the extent to which it's making these long-standing problems more difficult to deal with, and also to keep an openness towards any kind of opportunities and possibilities that might arise. And I think there's a handful of points just to finish on to try and address this. The first one, the project marvellously reveals the rich degree to which Brexit is going to have very geographically differentiated impacts across the UK's cities and regions. And if we want to try and get a tailored mix of policies to address the specific ways in which Brexit is unfolding in certain places, then this creates a real issue. The UK industrial strategy talks about a place-based approach, but it has real issues in terms of trying to connect that with a very vertical, sectoral kind of strategic approach. So again, some of the local industrial strategy pilots hopefully will be able to shed some light on how that might work. And there's some work being done, I think, about trying to understand how we can make these kind of industrial strategies more place-based and reflect the particular issues that Brexit might raise for certain places, which the project reveals very clearly. Secondly, continuing this theme of the extent to which Brexit is stirring up old issues that we've had to wrestle with, it raises the thorny old question about what's the appropriate scale for economic development institutions and policy. And we've been wrestling with this in England for decades. And if the thrust of the discussion is that we need more local discretion and resources to be able to address these kind of responses, then there are a number of areas which have been touched upon throughout. Sarah mentioned them earlier. So this idea that repatriation of powers from the EU can't just go back and sit at the national level. There needs to be some sense that these can be moved into the subnational space. That any kind of UK shared prosperity fund, which is going to be a hell of a programme if it's going to fill a huge gap in terms of resources and multiple kind of things that EU funding did in UK regions, that can't really end up as being something that will be centrally controlled with substantively less resources if it's going to fill that EU structural funds shaped hole. And thirdly, on this LEP review, the extent to which that will actually bolster rather than erode their capacity to actually address some of these issues then as key local actors. And thirdly, lastly, I think the interesting thing that the project reveals as well is this idea that if the exposure to Brexit is going to be felt very unevenly across the UK and not just in the north, then it raises some politically interesting issues about the kinds of alliances, cooperation, networks that can be built to try and help areas to address their particular challenges as a result of Brexit. And I think just to finish, the project, I think, does a marvellous job in giving us some proper evidence to wrestle with in terms of dealing with this issue of Brexit. It's very impressive and important in doing that. And I think the idea that this increased exposure of the weaker economies to Brexit should let us really make it much more urgent, I think, in terms of how we go about dealing with this. Because I think the risk is that some people and places that have been left behind and that we've heard very clearly linked to the Brexit vote are going to get left even further behind if we're not careful from the developments that we've been hearing about and the project reveals. And this ultimately compromises national government's aims then to rebalance the economy, to spread wealth and prosperity across the UK. Thanks.
That brings us to the end of this discussion. I think a really fascinating and serious discussion there about exactly what the implications are of Brexit for the regions and for the North. And I think it's great to get a really serious piece of evidence which starts to give us some clues as to where the impacts are going to fall, particularly as many of you will be going away to put together your local industrial strategy. So I think it's really timely and really valuable to be able to have this event today and to hear from the work of City-REDI in Birmingham. I think that there's sort of two kind of things just to finish off on. First is about the seriousness of the challenge and the implications that are for the North in terms of its jobs, in terms of its sectoral strengths. And secondly, in terms of the importance of economic governance at work. And we've already heard that, how the impact of Brexit actually helps to make the case stronger for a better appreciation of economic governance and for devolution to those places, so that you can start to put together a much more place-based approach to the economic challenge. I'd just like to finish by thanking our speakers, and if we can do that in the traditional way.